Dr. Padmanabhan on reimagining energy efficiency in India, a paradigm shift. So I welcome Dr. Padu S Padmanabhan, who has been a, well-known expert in the area of energy, water, and environment, and has led various initiatives from much before I started my career. And while connecting to him, it was good that we were able to uh, guess where we had met each other earlier. So, Mr. Padmanabhan's last formal assignment was as Program Director of the South Asia Regional Initiative for Energy and as Senior Energy Advisor for USAID in India. He also served at the World Bank, Washington, as Energy Efficiency Specialist, and he was a visiting fellow at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center at Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Currently, he works out of Bangalore and Pittsburgh. So, in today's discussion, Dr. Padmanabhan will take us through uh, a reimagined energy efficiency strategy for India. What it should look like as we uh, take care of as we proceed with different sets of initiatives and how they are developing and how it will change over the next few years. Some key points today will be including energy efficiency as a performance indicator, then shifting attention to demand side of energy equation, integrated energy networks for deep decarbonization, the water energy nexus, which has been talked about and becomes even more important each day, and the energy productivity as a key performance indicator. The discussion is very critical to our work in the energy sector at CSTEP, as well as uh, for the country, for the sector as a whole. And let's hope you enjoy this discussion. Uh, the format is going to be like this. I'll hand over to Mr. Padmanabhan, who will proceed with his presentation for about 40-45 minutes. Then we'll take a few questions. He will take a few questions and discussion points from my end. Then we will open the floor to for questions and answers from other participants. So my request is that as I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Padmanabhan, my request is that you please mute your microphones and please put your questions in the chat box, which we will try to follow and take one by one at the end of the webinar. So hope you have a meaningful session. Over to you, Dr. Padmanabhan.
Good evening. My greetings and welcome to the staff of CSTEP and others. For the next 40 minutes or so, I hope to briefly trace the evolution of what one refers to as energy efficiency in India, discuss the merits of energy productivity strategy, of which energy efficiency is a subset, provide the theoretical underpinnings of energy productivity metrics, or alternately, its converse, which is energy intensity. And hopefully, at the end of it all, make a convincing techno-economic case for expanding the scope of energy efficiency beyond the limits and boundaries it has set itself today by focusing on a very new, refreshingly new approach. So this is a full agenda with a question and answer at the end of it for about 30 minutes. Yeah, the this is the India sectoral energy consumption. Looking at the trend of energy consumption in India over the past decades, the largest portion of commercial energy is consumed in industry, both directly in process and indirectly as non-energy or feedstock, for almost 45% of the total consumption. Other sectors like building and transport, largely buildings. Most of my presentation will be on industry. And here again, the major consumers are steel, which is about 33%. Then there is non-metallic, that is ceramic, refractory, glass, and so on, which is about 15%. Chemicals and fertilizers is about 2 to 5%. And of course, the MSME sector, which is about 39% or so. So the implications, I think this is important. The implications of the presentation are sector neutral, but the examples that are cited are large industry. Next. See, this is a graph of the IEA 450 scenario. The International Energy Agency has called energy efficiency as the first fuel. And this is based on a study of 11 OECD members out of the 17 member countries between 2005 and 2015. And the study basically showed that more energy was saved through energy efficiency than that was consumed by these countries in terms of fossil fuels or renewable energy. So they provided a much needed visibility and respectability to energy efficiency, and IEA called it the first fuel. This graph is a little dated, and it's the principle behind the graph that's important. And this is a graph about worldwide carbon emissions between now and 2035 or 2040, where there's a business as usual scenario where carbon emissions continue to increase. There is a graph below that, which is this green line, which talks about how carbon emissions can reduce through the intervention of certain policies and technologies, or what they call as wedges. There are almost 5 wedges, of which efficiency is the most prominent wedge. And what it basically says is that efficiency can reduce the carbon emissions to the level of 450 ppm to keep climate temperatures below 2.5 degrees centigrade, and the major contribution will be by efficiency. Can you have the next graph?
Is it visible
the next
now?
one is, yeah, visible. The next one is on India and Indian industry, and it says almost the same thing, that the major contribution to reduction of emissions between now and 2050 to bring it below 450 ppm to meet international standards and so on will largely be by efficiency. Now, the question to ask is, can energy efficiency today bring about the extraordinary level of savings in India of 41% of carbon emissions by 2050 in the industrial energy use, and perhaps a similar percentage in other sectors to achieve the deep decarbonization goals which have been set forth? This is not a rhetorical question, but a very realistic one. Can energy efficiency, as is being practiced today, deliver the goods together with renewable energy, nuclear, CCS, and so on? I think, to be blunt about it, it cannot, unless it is fortified sufficiently with other parallel strategies. What these would be will be the subject of my talk. But before that, we need to look back a little into history before we look forward on what else needs to be done as far as energy efficiency is concerned. Can we have the next slide, please? Well, the next slide before it comes, let me quickly describe it. It's the historical evolution of energy efficiency trends in India. We look back in order to project what we would like to see in the future. Now, as per the historical evolution, the stage one of energy efficiency was between 65 and 1965 to 80. And at that time, the term was not energy efficiency, the term was fuel efficiency. And there is a interesting story behind that. A story which I would like to relate to all of you. At that point in time, it was in the mid 60s, almost most of the commercial energy was consumed in industry, and much of it was in Mumbai, in the textile industry. And most of them were using coal at that time. And even in those days, Mumbai was getting crowded, and there was a need to save space. And coal, as you know, takes a lot of storage space. And apart from that, coal had to be transported from Bengal, Bihar in wagons. The wagons were scarce, and they had to go over the Western Ghats. So the supply of coal was not entirely reliable. Coincidentally, at that point in time, two refineries were operational in Mumbai, in Chembur, Esso and I think it was Burma Shell. These were two refineries in operation, and they had excess viscous fuel oil, refinery bottoms, as you call it, also referred to as furnace oil, which they wanted to market. And selling it to the textile industries in Mumbai in place of coal made perfect marketing sense. The government of India at that point in time invited an entity in the UK called NIFES, National Institute of Fuel Efficiency Service, to help India transition from coal to fuel oil, transition them and help them in the storage, handling, preparation of oil, of which India had very little experience those days. The NIFES study suggested a fuel efficiency program in the country, and the National Productivity Council of India was chosen to provide the service. And it was one of the first institutionalized arrangement which took place on efficiency in India. By the end of the 60s, the government realized the need for understanding the supply-demand balance in order to plan for the energy requirements of the country. A report known as the Fuel Policy Committee report was developed in 1970 or thereabouts to examine and suggest the country's national fuel policy for the next 15 years. This report marked the official beginnings of an energy efficiency or fuel efficiency, as it was referred to at that time. This report was also the basis for the establishment of a standing committee on furnace oil, which was established under the Ministry of Industry. So in 1973, when the oil price hike took place and the OPEC crisis began, the Standing Committee on Furnace Oil helped structure the establishment of the Petroleum Conservation Research Association, and energy efficiency, or rather fuel efficiency, took root. First in industry, later in transport, and then in agriculture. In the 80s, and please bear with me for a moment on this, I won't take too long. In the 80s, the government of India set up the Interministerial Working Group on Energy Conservation. The term fuel efficiency was dropped, and the word was energy conservation, since it was felt that there are social and lifestyle choices associated with energy use, and the word conservation better described these. And that was no different than what happened in the United States at that point in time. Some of you might remember President Carter and his famous fireside chat in the US on energy conservation, where he talked about curtailment and sacrifice and so on. The term energy efficiency came into its own in India much later, in the late 80s and early 90s, together with energy audit and the like, and has been extensively used since then. In 2015, the concept of energy productivity began to circulate. So I shall be discussing this which is what I call a stage 4 of where we are presently, in the context of 3 elements, which I think will determine the reimagined energy efficiency structure in India. The first is shift to the demand side of the energy equation, energy productivity as the metrics, and third is integrative energy approach towards energy efficiency, integrated approach towards energy efficiency. Next. Abhishek, can we move to the next slide, please? The next slide, let me begin, is about the need for India to balance investment in supply and demand. This is a cardinal principle that we need to introduce, perhaps through regulatory means, of the need for integrated resource planning. Basically, looking at both sides of the energy equation, supply and demand, symmetrically, not sequentially. Historically, since the first 5-year plan onwards, we have been exclusively supply-oriented. I can understand this, we can all understand this, because in the 1950s, we were around 1.5 gigawatts. Today, we are around 375 gigawatts of installed capacity. In terms of coal, we used to mine 25 million tons of coal in the early 50s, and today we are well over 650 million tons. But we need to look at both sides of the energy equation and put in our resources where one gets the most bang out of the buck, as they say. Typically, the cost of conserved energy, efficiency technologies, is 1/5 to 1/10 the cost of an equivalent amount of power generated. If every supply project were required to examine the potential for demand side management in their service territory before the decision to set up a generating plant, one can quickly scale the application of energy efficiency. It has its challenges. Anybody will tell you that it's much easier to put up a 1,000 megawatt power plant than to save 1,000 megawatts from the grid. It's the principle behind the application of integrated resource planning that would help in reimagining the role of energy efficiency. Next.
Is it there?
Not yet, but see, what is energy productivity and why is it relevant? I think this is important just to provide the background to what I'll be saying later. That energy productivity is, when defined, is a measure of the economic value we receive from each unit of energy that we use. It is calculated by dividing the total economic output, or the GDP, or a company's revenue by the amount of energy consumed. It is a very simple metric, but it's a very powerful metric. By measuring energy productivity over time, we can determine how effectively any entity or nation or a company is using the energy it pays for. See, policymakers in India are now increasingly recognizing the issue of accelerating the rate of growth by having energy productivity as the center of economic planning. It's beginning to happen, but rather slowly. And such of us who have been examining it, we realize that energy productivity is a new policy narrative, but it can amplify the energy efficiency agenda greatly. And the elements of energy productivity, which I'll be talking about in the next few slides, would be economic diversification, modernization, and energy efficiency policies have to be in sync to address this. So enhancing the value that India receives from energy should be central to economic planning. Next. Well, energy productivity is all about how energy resources can maximize economic value and welfare for society. See, the classical factors of production are labor and financial capital and physical capital and energy and so on. And when these are applied across sectors like buildings, industry, transport, power and water, and so on, generates economic activities that generate value that totals the GNP. In this scenario, two choices, not mutually exclusive, appear. One is energy efficiency, that is minimizing the energy used in producing outputs, and the other is energy productivity, which is maximizing the value created from energy use. So there are two key understandings. One is energy efficiency is a byproduct of energy productivity, and energy productivity is about enhancing the value the society gets from the use of its energy resources. Next. This is a straightforward formula for energy productivity. The summation of economic benefits, environmental benefits, and social benefits, which amounts to the GDP, divided by the total primary energy use. But if one were to look at the formula a little closely, other relationships between economic benefits and environment and social development in nations and energy use become evident. See, primary energy use is a function of per capita energy consumption, and it's very low. Let me repeat that because there's some noise in the background. This is important to have an understanding of what comes later. Primary energy use is a function of per capita energy consumption, and it's very low at the early stage of a nation's economic development. At this early stage, energy productivity is typically high. Please understand, energy productivity is typically high at the early stage of economic development. And that basically reflects the fact that while national economies might be small, energy consumption is very low due to lack of industrialization, lack of access to modern services like heating, cooling, and electrification, and so on, like the pre-industrial era, applicable to some of the sub-Saharan countries, I would imagine, today. What I just now described is known as the Kuznets hypothesis. So energy productivity in the Kuznets hypothesis is very high early stages and declines as it grows because of increased energy density and per capita income due to industrialization and however, this changes in the economy, and as the economy matures and diversifies, the industry moving up the value chain and services such as IT, health, and education are available, this maturity is accompanied by a decrease in energy intensity and consequently many of the industrialized nations to this phase. In fact, they begin to plateau out as far as energy productivity is concerned because they've had a steady growth in energy productivity because of the phenomena I just now described. India has now entered this phase. The question is, can it be speeded up? Next. See, energy productivity puts energy at the center of economic planning. And as I said, it's a new policy narrative that is broader than energy efficiency. Why is that so? This table provides a comparison between the two. The first point is energy efficiency is a bottom line issue. It contributes to cost reduction. While on the other hand, energy productivity is a top line investment issue and has direct contribution to profits. The second point is that energy efficiency is all about how energy is used. Where is it used? How efficiently it is used? What are the opportunities for saving energy, and so on and so forth. Whereas energy productivity seeks to locate answers on what the energy is used for. So while energy efficiency is very operational and tactical, energy productivity is more directed towards strategic issues of modernization and diversification of economic activities. From this, it follows that energy efficiency is generally concerned with individual technologies, pumps, blowers, compressors, boilers, you look at individual technologies. Whereas energy productivity looks at technological complementarity. This is a very important point, and I'll be discussing this at great detail when I talk about design integration later. And there are other differences also, but as you come down, and the last point is that energy efficiency is a micro level concept. As I often say, it's a boiler room kind of a concept, whereas energy productivity is both a micro concept, both a boiler room idea as well as a boardroom agenda. Next.
Yeah.
Right. It takes about 5 to 10 seconds. Pardon me, we have to kind of live with this. I'm sorry about this, but we just have to work through this problem. Energy productivity can be seen at different levels of the economy. Basically, energy productivity encompasses approaches at two levels. One is the microeconomic or corporate level, and the other is the macro level. So the microeconomic or corporate level, it is a combination of energy efficiency through technical interventions, which all of you are familiar with, and product diversification and modernization, which is aimed at increasing corporate revenue and hence value. This part of it is how and what energy is used for. The macro approach is to the reduction of energy intensity of the economy, or its converse, because energy productivity is the converse of energy intensity. What it really means is that the macroeconomic level, one can decouple energy consumption and GDP. And this is what has happened among the G5 countries in the US or Japan and Germany. These countries have decoupled energy consumption and GDP, and the decoupling absolute. GDP has increased while energy growth has reduced. But when you come to countries like India and also China, this is also happening. But here the decoupling is relative. In other words, while GDP has increased, energy consumption is also increased, but the rate of growth of energy consumption has slowed. So there's relative decoupling. And as we will see later, next. Well, the next slide is on energy productivity and the metrics. This is important, and after this, I'll show you some further slides on energy productivity in the Indian context and how India, and particularly Indian industry, relates in terms of energy intensity and so on. Can we have the next slide, please? Well, before we answer the question of how energy intensity and energy productivity relate in the Indian context, particularly in the Indian industrial context, before we answer that question, we need to understand energy productivity a little more. Energy productivity and its metrics can be. Oh, can you come back to the previous one, please? I think you overshot. I think you overshot and went off to another slide.
Is it the correct slide?
Yeah, we have it. Yeah, this is the correct slide. Right. See, we need to understand energy productivity a little more. And energy productivity and its metrics can be defined at four fundamental levels. The level one is level aggregate energy productivity indicators, mentioning all along the ratio of GDP to national energy consumption. Level two is disaggregated, and it is at the level of sectoral indicators, and it's the ratio of sectoral value add to energy consumed by the sector. Level three is subsectoral indicators, like whether it's refinery or cement or textile or whatever it may be. Disaggregated energy productivity indicators defined as the ratio of sectoral value add or other subsectoral value add to energy consumed by the subsector. Level 4 is what many of you may be familiar with, is plant level energy efficiency indicators. Specific energy consumption defined as the total energy consumed by the plant divided by the physical manufactured outputs. The only point to note is that level 4 beyond, we define the indicators a little differently. They are energy intensity indicators. The other indicators, level 1, 2, and 3, are energy productivity indicators. Can we move? Next. Abhishek, next, please. The next is on the energy productivity trends in India and how does it compare globally. See, the important point is that between 1990 and 2015, and even today, energy productivity has grown in almost all major economies of the world, including India, where it grew by 72%. And you'll see that in that slide, which is taking some time for it to come. I'm not able to see it yet. See, between 1990 and 2015, energy productivity rose, as I said, in all major economies of the world, including India, where it rose by about 72%. This increase was in part due to India's economic and industrial reforms of 1991 and rising per capita incomes from a relatively low base. It was also due to the expansion and modernization of industry, energy-intensive heavy industry, reflecting higher levels of efficiency in 2005, 10, and so on. Now, looking at the global shifts in some detail, it can be seen that China had greater success in improving energy efficiency or energy productivity, 203% over the same time period as us, starting with relatively the same per capita energy consumption. And this also reflected in China a massive infrastructure expansion, which accelerated in India in the mid-2000s, a decade and a half after China. And you'll see that in almost every country, in Germany, Australia, everywhere, there had been an increase in energy productivity. It's only in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, KSA, where energy productivity actually declined over this period of time, and now it's kind of plateaued. And largely because energy and efficiency of energy use is rather poor. But we'll talk about it a little more later. Next. I'm not going to spend too much of time on this. This basically says what I've been saying earlier. In all the G20 countries, energy productivity from 2010 to 2018 have increased from values from 25-30% to as high as it's on energy intensity and trends in India and other countries. You'll see that in China, China is where the energy intensity has declined tremendously. From what it was in the early 2000s to what it is around today, almost 5% year upon year. It has also declined in G20 countries and in India. In India, it's declined by about 0.8% per year, whereas in G20 countries, it has declined by 0.7% per year. As I said earlier, Saudi Arabia, actually, energy intensity has increased, although of late it has begun to plateau. But it is in China where the reduction in energy intensity has been the greatest, 5% year upon year. Next. We need to study the Indian energy intensity trends a little more closely. As I said earlier, I think in the first or second slide, I said 40% of the total energy consumption in India is attributed to the industrial sector. And this is expected to increase to 50% by 2050 at a compounded average annual growth rate of 4.4%, with energy intensive industries, iron and steel, cement, and so on and so forth, accounting for over 50% of the total energy consumption in the industrial sector. The balance 50% would be from light industries like food and textile and wood products and many others, brick making and so on and so forth. To understand, I think this is important, how the Indian industrial sector contributes to energy productivity in the economy, it is important to analyze the energy productivity trends, energy intensity trends. Both industrial growth rates and energy consumption in the pre-COVID days were strong in India, averaging about 7% of GDP growth and 5% of energy growth annually. However, as I mentioned earlier, industrial energy intensity had been wavering over this period. It is the green line you can see, with an average decline of 0.6. This needs to be contrasted with the example which I showed earlier of China, where energy intensity has declined by 5% every year for the last 15 to 20 years and is among the highest rates of improvement in the world. Next. Now, to understand a lot more closely why the energy intensity has declined in India, but not declined as much as we would like to, we need to decompose energy demand and look at energy efficiency and structure change separately. See, the important point is that energy productivity is affected by two main factors: the underlying energy efficiency of the economy and the structure of the economy. Improving energy efficiency of the economy without any change in its structure will improve energy productivity, no doubt, but it will not improve it very much. However, modernizing and diversifying from energy intensive industries to less energy intensive sectors, including services, will more dramatically improve energy productivity. Energy productivity program, there are two. Here is the orange line, which talks about energy efficiency, and here is the yellow line, which talks about structure change in the economy. And in India, both have happened. However, one needs to raise the slope of the structure change as they're done in China, and one has to raise the base of the energy efficiency line. But I think, let me give you some examples. Energy productivity enhancement program normally should consider a pragmatic blend of energy efficiency measures, technological modernization, and industrial product diversification. Let me illustrate with a few examples. The average specific energy consumption in India was higher compared to industrialized countries if you do a gap analysis. In the industry sectors of petroleum refining, chemicals, petrochemicals, particularly ammonia and methanol manufacture, aluminum smelting, iron and steel, etc., etc. Also, India has the lowest specific energy consumption in cement and clinker manufacture among all the industrialized and developing countries, including possibly the countries in transition. In the case of the former set of industries, where India's specific energy consumption is higher than the global average, such as petrochemicals, refineries, and so on, the ability to improve energy productivity through improvements in energy efficiency is very limited. I'm not saying it's not required. It needs to be done, but it's very limited, and it will not help us meet international best practices. That can only be done by modernization and diversification. That is by moving up the value chain and modernization. In the case of cement, we have achieved high energy productivity due to the fact that energy efficiency through shop floor interventions must transit to high value addition strategies. We need to move energy efficiency from the boiler room to the boardroom. But when we move it into the boardroom, we need to move it differently as an energy productivity exercise. And those that have done it, like the cement industry, have actually competed very well globally and are among the best in the world. Next. The next slide has come. If it has, shall I start describing it?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah, okay, it's come. Yeah. This is an industrial strategy to introduce energy productivity. An industrial strategy that moves the economy from producing basic energy intensive products and processes such as steel and aluminum or paper to specialty high value added products. I mean, the question we need to ask is, do we want to manufacture aluminum ingots or go all the way and manufacture aeroplane fuselages? Do we want to manufacture just mild steel or go all the way and manufacture specialty steels used in cardboard paper or newsprint paper, specialty paper? It is being done, but the pace and direction at which it needs to be done. A paper plant in East India that manufactured paper indigenous pulp used in stationery, paper, and the like. After a study of the market, they switched to specialty pulp. Rather, they switched to specialty paper using log fiber. Consumed for a ton of the specialty paper was almost the same as when they were making cardboard and newsprint. But the value addition was 200%. The value addition was 200%. The revenues per unit of energy consumed almost doubled. So that's just one example, and there are many more examples. Next.
Sorry, Mr. Padmanabhan, may I just request you to repeat the example because your voice was breaking? So at least.
Okay. Okay. Let me. There was a plant in East India. See, they study the market and all that to switch to specialty paper. But the specialty paper used different fibers, the longer fiber blended with the pulp that they normally used for making stationery paper. But the important bottom line was this: the energy they consume for a ton of the specialty paper, was almost the same as the energy they consume for the ton of the ordinary paper that they were making earlier. But the value addition was 200%.
Right.
See, mapping out energy productivity roadmap brings out two issues which are in very stark contrast. Energy productivity strategy with diversification to high different from energy efficiency strategy. And for one thing, investments needs are higher for diversification and modernization. That's but natural. And sources of generally energy efficiency strategy is funded from internal funds or by third-party ESCOs. On the other hand, energy productivity strategy, which is modernization, is financed by bank soft loans or capital markets. The regulatory changes for energy productivity are much more onerous since they involve company law, MRTP, stipulations, and the like. The nature of skills are also very markedly different. So the point I want to leave behind, in essence, is that the value created per unit of energy consumed requires financial policy and regulatory inputs that are poles apart from energy efficiency strategy. So I think we need to be important to recognize it. While energy efficiency is a subset of energy productivity, the productivity strategy, if taken to its logical conclusion, requires the marshalling of efforts both on finance and regulations and other areas to an extent that an efficiency strategy does not. I mean, I think we need to kind of appreciate that we are onto another set of, and it's a different ball game altogether. Next. This would be the last slide, not on energy productivity. I mean, last slide of productivity. I move on to my the second theme, which should not take much longer. See, we also need to recognize that energy productivity is part of an integrated energy network. And that network has three interrelated components. One is efficiency, second is renewables, and the third is structural change, or the IEN, Integrated Energy Network. And sometimes it is called as sector coupling. And it's perhaps the approach we need to take to decarbonize our national economy. I don't want to get into the subject. I just wanted to bring out the context in which energy productivity should be seen as part of a broader integrated energy network to decarbonize the Indian economy. It's a subject in and by itself, and maybe a subject for another webinar altogether. Next. Abhishek, can we go on to the next one, please?
I've moved on, I think. Yeah, it will take a few seconds.
Yeah. See, I would like to take a short detour here and focus on a very important aspect of redefining and reimagining energy efficiency, the subject of integrated designs. See, here are 4 quadrants which map out the industrial energy efficiency technology opportunities. The first quadrant is what I call as quick hits. It's part of what we in the fuel efficiency world are very familiar with, good practices, housekeeping measures, first aid measures, saving energy through short-term, no-cost, low-cost measures, and so on. And most Indian industries have done it. So there isn't much really to discuss here. The second quadrant, I call them as must-dos. And these consist of technologies which are to be implemented or are being implemented at the shop floor level, like efficient motors, efficient boilers, better steam distribution, and so on and so forth. But these are individual technologies. And I would like to halt here for a moment. The key operative term here is individual technologies without considering integrative designs that optimally combines these individual technologies. By doing so, we are achieving only a fraction of the energy efficiency potential available and perhaps overstating its costs. Quadrant 3 is integrative designs, such as pumping systems and cooling systems in industry, pinch point applications in industry, process industry, advanced heat power, etc. I shall come back to this issue of integrative design in a moment, so please bear with me until then. And quadrant 4, of course, is transformational technologies. There's circular economy, digital manufacture, nanotechnology, and all of them are cutting edge. So as far as Indian industry is concerned, it is still very futuristic. So let's get back to quadrant 2 and 3 where we are. Quadrant 2 where we are, perhaps happy because with the limited energy efficiency savings of individual technologies. But we are knocking on the doors of quadrant 3 of integrative design that promises large potential savings and savings in CapEx and OpEx. So let's study the concept of integrated technologies and what they mean, or are the integrated designs for energy efficiency, and how it could raise the level of efficiency at the shop floor level by a factor of 2 or 3. Next. The next slide is basically the limitations of energy efficiency design today. See, the question to ask, am I audible, Neha?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. The question to ask is, what are the limitations of energy efficiency design as they relate to individual technologies? See, our research, as I can see it, is typically structured to develop efficiency technologies around individual standalone systems or subsystems, not on design methods that are, what should I say, inclusive. So let's observe the limitations of energy efficiency design in this graph. We have on the y-axis the marginal cost of efficiency improvement, meaning the marginal cost for every additional or incremental energy savings. It's a reasonably steep curve, and hence the marginal cost of the next increment of savings is greater, and so on. On the x-axis, we have the cumulative energy savings. And we all know from economic theory, generally, it assumes that diminishing returns for situations like this. In other words, the more efficiency we seek to obtain, the more steep is the marginal cost of the next increment of savings until it becomes too costly and we stop. We stop at a point where it does not make economic sense to tap any further energy savings because it's not cost effective. We do not want to cross the cost effectiveness limit. It may be because of the return on investment policy of the company or whatever. But as the next table will show, integrative designs often lead to expanding results, further big additional savings at a lower marginal cost of incremental savings. Next. What is integrative redesign? So what we are trying to do here is that we are trying to the cost effectiveness limit. The barrier that held us back when we looked at the large cost of energy savings is no longer a barrier if our approach is much more inclusive, much more integrative. What does this mean? Let me give 3 examples, one from building and one from industry and one from the hotel sector. The one on building, and I'm trying to keep it simple here. How much thermal insulation in a house would one need to heat losses in winter? The design approach is to choose the thickness of insulating wool that will repay its marginal cost from the present value of the saved marginal heating. But this approach that is individually stylized to look at insulation technology only omits the capital cost of the heating system in the home. It omits the boiler, the pipeline, the fan, the blowers, the electronics, and so on and so forth. So if one were to look at cheaper alternatives to the heating system, such as heat pumps or heat exchangers, air-to-air heat exchangers, or maybe, I don't know, there are a whole range of alternatives. Technologies would be far greater at a lower marginal cost of incremental energy savings. By doing so, the tunnel cost, which has held you back when you look at the individual technologies, such as just insulation, but when you look at the thing in total, you'll see this. Now, let's look at a common industrial application, very common in Indian industry. Electric motors account for 60% of the industrial energy consumption. Much of it is for pumping water or for circulating in factories. There's an example of an industry, chemical dye plant, that reduced pumping power of a cooling water loop from 70 kilowatts to 10 kilowatts, 80% less, lower capex and opex, and much better performance. How did they do it? They did it by 2 changes reflecting Indian design mentality. The first was use big pipes and small pumps, not big pumps and small pipes. When one uses a pipe of a grade, pipe friction falls nearly the 5th power of diameter. That means the capital cost also falls, and their cost falls as the cost of the bigger pipe rises as only the 2nd power of diameter. Thus, optimizing the pipe of a optimizing the whole system yields big pipes and small pumps with low capex and small opex. Of course, the correlate to all this is that you have to lay out the pipes first and then the equipment. The third example is in the hotel industry, well known in the Indian hotel industry, I'm sure, is the over-design of chiller systems in hotels. You cool a room in a hotel, Now, with changes in illumination technology, you have large-scale use of LEDs and whereas incandescent lamps and fluorescent lamps run hot. And large-scale use of LEDs, you have less heat to abstract. So because there's less heat to abstract, so does your cooling load reduce. And there's also changes in because of natural ventilation and insulation, the heat that you need to abstract is less. So your cooling load reduces. So one can save on capital cost by having a smaller chiller. And in the Indian context, one can also have a small standby diesel generating plant because most hotels have standby diesel generating plants. So there's capital savings and energy savings all along the way if one were to follow an integrative approach. These were just three fairly simple examples, but there could be very many more. But I think the important point to make is that we have not been taught to look at things in an integrated way. You know, most of the design that we are taught is structured to develop efficiency technologies, not design methods which are integrative. And also there's this force of habit, you know, the fear of deviating from standard practice. What my first boss in NPC, Mr. P.R. Srinivasan, used to say, the factor of ignorance, which is actually the factor of safety, but actually the factor of ignorance, that they like to go in for large systems in the unlikely event that there's a failure of one kind or the other. So an integrative approach will enable us to design systems which bring down the energy consumed for the entire system and not look interesting area. We haven't done much about it in India. The person who's been championing it, as some of you probably may know, is Amory Lovins at Rocky Mountain Institute. They have been doing quite a lot of work on integrative design. And I would strongly suggest that we really move forward to look at integrative design systems which can be incorporated in Indian industry. Next, last one. Next. Both supply and demand sequentially but symmetrically. We need to put in more effort on the demand side of the energy equation. It's a principle more than anything else. IRP must now be standard operating practice for the Indian energy sector and the power sector. Regulators need to step in and set up before the utility has to now take opportunities and invest in some programs and whatever balance power is required to be put on the supply side of the equation. The second point is we need to place energy productivity at the center of economic planning. I had shown several slides why energy productivity looks at what the energy is used for rather than how it is used. How it is used is efficiency and is important. But the moment you ask the question, what is it used for, then you start looking at value. And it's value that is what the market wants and what the market rewards. And the third point is we need to promote integrative energy efficiency designs. They have a factor of efficiency than looking at equipments and technologies in isolation. And a combination of all these three would, in my mind, be a reimagined energy efficiency strategy for the country. So thank you for bearing with me, bearing with all the interruptions. I'm sorry about it. But now over to Abhishek to take this forward.
Thank you, Dr. Padmanabhan, for your presentation. I think you began with the year of 1960 and 65 and told us many things that we have definitely not experienced firsthand, even if some of us may have read about it somewhere. But one thing that comes to my mind is, as you have talked about first NPC doing this fuel efficiency thing, then coming of PCRA, and in 2004, this coming of Energy Efficiency Act and setting up of Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Do you also, and you have also talked about looking at it from the economy level down to looking at it at the unit level. Do you also see changes in the structural changes in the policy space, energy efficiency policy space, where this reimagined energy efficiency concept will be able to come to fruition?
I'll try to answer your question as to the energy policy interventions which would be required for making the kind of structural changes that we are talking about. See, we must recognize that in the 70s, when energy efficiency first came into being in the country through fuel efficiency, the focus was abundantly clear. It was to reduce the incidence of imports of oil, because as a country, almost 75% of our export earnings was in importing oil. And the focus at that time was on what ways and means to reduce our dependence on petroleum fuels, particularly the lighter fuels such as diesel, which had, a major part of the oil import bill. So all the policies and so on were geared in that direction. It was only in the mid 70s, or rather early 80s, there was this recognition that one needs to have a broader policy for fuel in India, which looks at interfuel substitution and which also looks at the role which energy efficiency could play and what was known as energy conservation those days. Again, the focus was only in the industrial sector because at that time there wasn't much understanding or appreciation of energy use in the other sectors. For instance, the transport sector, it was very much petrol used in four-wheelers. Two-wheelers were hardly there in the country, and our petrol consumption was very, very low. Diesel consumption in transport was a bit of an issue, but that was well contained. And certainly building energy efficiency wasn't an issue. So we never looked at things holistically across the economy until the Fuel Policy Committee report came into being, and that looked a little bit at the industrial sector and no more. So our policies again were geared, if at all, on the industrial sector. And again, the policies were related to first aid measures, the quadrant 1 measures that I talked about in my slide. I looked at something which can be done at home. Financing was not at all brought into the picture. So it was a very loosely structured kind of a policy. There was complete lack of coordination. The power ministry worked separately from the industry ministry. No one was talking to one another, and so on and so forth. The electrical sector did not join the efficiency bandwagon those days. It was all really the petroleum sector and to some extent the coal sector. So even among the energy ministries, there was lack of coordination. It was only in 2002 when the Bureau of Energy Efficiency came up, they began to have some kind of a coordinated policy, which then started looking at the issues that I'm talking about. But again, looking at energy productivity as a pincer edge of our strategy came up much, much later, only in 2015. And that too, it's something that the Planning Commission has been mentioning from time to time, but the implementation mechanism of the country, the mechanism is yet to fall in place. My last point on this is a point which we need to keep in mind, that all that I'm talking about actually has to be, you need leadership, both political leadership, and one has to kind of rise beyond the levels of a ministry. And one must avoid over-bureaucratizing energy efficiency. And that has always been a challenge. Where would energy productivity reside? Would it reside in the planning commission, which is not a technique, which is not a economic ministry? It's only a planning department, or would it reside elsewhere? That's something that the country needs to think about very seriously, because the potential for efficiency and the potential for energy productivity in the country is very large. It's the first fuel. It will be an energy resource. We need to kind of look at it the same way as we look at oil and forms of energy, and for which one really needs not just a department, but an entity which can take a leadership position here, and under a ministry, at least under a full-time minister. This is my personal view.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. You have pointed out really well that at some point of time these ministries were not talking to each other directly. And of course, it's a very welcome change for us that with coming of Bureau of Energy Efficiency, I think some things have changed, and a number of uh, times we get Ministry of Power, MNRE, MOEFCC talking together, coming together on projects. My concern regarding this is another a different on a different aspect. As we see increasing electrification of loads, and as we see increasing production of electricity from renewable energy, which is basically the push that is coming from the climate change angle. So, because of this climate change angle and the delinking of energy, or rather electricity generation, from carbon emissions, do you think there is a chance that we may again lose our path, because the prime motive, climate change or the carbon emissions, would maybe it gets addressed by solar and wind and tidal, and we may again lose our path? Is that a possibility you see happening?
I see it as a silver lining and as an opportunity more than losing a path, and I'll tell you why. Electrification through renewables on the supply side would enable us to move closer to this plan of sector coupling, or what I call as integrated energy networks, of which efficiency is a part. So let's look at a scenario where you have more and more generation from renewables. And obviously, renewables has its problems and issues related to intermittence and so on. But keeping that aside for a moment, and that energy is used, and obviously, since it's renewable, it'll have little or no carbon, and that energy is used to generate, let us say, hydrogen through electrolysis, and that hydrogen can then be used in a number of ways. It can be used in fuel cells to generate power. It can be used to make biofuels, and those biofuels can be used to replace fossil fuels such as oil and gas and so on. So in effect, what we are doing is, through renewables, we are setting up a system which enables us to get other energy sources which are environmentally sound and which are carbon neutral. And efficiency obviously plays a key role in all of this, because you cannot do it without a high energy efficiency of energy conversion and so on and so forth. So this targets for decarbonization through an integrated energy networks is, to my mind, the next big transition that we would probably, the world will see. And India needs to be part of that. And we need to see it in one context. Our carbon emissions on the demand side of the energy equation is much higher than the carbon emissions on the supply side. So what that tells us is that wherever end use is used, we need to substitute the carbon there with renewables, or in this case, a carrier like hydrogen. And that hydrogen needs to be generated through renewables, obviously. And that particular technology will be key for us moving along a path of net zero carbon emissions in time to come. So I don't see it as a problem, Abhishek. There will be problems along the way, but I see that as the big picture. And the elements of what I'm talking about, and that's the interesting point, is already in a sense in place. We have a handle on large-scale renewable power generation. We are beginning to have a handle on hydrogen generation through electrolysis, etc. It's very wasteful now, very inefficient, but probably over a period of time that could be dealt with. And then conversion of hydrogen into synthetic fuels and biofuels is something that we can definitely work on. And we can have this panorama of technologies, if I may say so, come together to deliver lowest carbon emitted economy.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. As you pointed out, hydrogen as one of the possible ways which will take us to to a new renewable future. Can you, from your vast international experience, can you, in brief, give us a little guidance on which countries to look towards when it comes to technologies like hydrogen and production of hydrogen from renewables? From your experience, if you can just in short reply to that.
The country which has gone the longest way on an integrated energy network, the IEN, which is electrification through renewables and using the electricity to generate hydrogen and to generate the value added that I talked about, is Germany. Germany is probably the country to go to for a better understanding of how this integrated energy network of the future would be. There are definitely developments in North America too, the US. I'm familiar with some of the work that EPRI has been doing, but they are still yet to move into commercial parlance. Whereas Germany, because of their tremendous work in renewables in the last very many years, grid-connected renewables, they have now been able to develop a vision for their country to move towards a low carbon or zero carbon economy in the next 15, 20 years. An integrated energy network is part of that, of which efficiency is a key part of whatever I'm saying.
Yeah, maybe it's time to turn to some questions that the participants have also asked. So the first question from Mr. Shekhar is why energy audit could not be forced in the same line as financial audits have been?
Well, that's an interesting question. Why energy audits cannot be made mandatory? And I think that's an exercise which needs to be looked at. Certainly, one could make it mandatory, but I would actually make a counterpoint to that. You see, an energy audit in and by itself is only a way station. It's not a destination. An energy audit will tell you where the energy is being wasted and what efficiency measures are required to counter that waste. It's important for management to know that, but an energy audit in and by itself will not save you any energy. It'll point out to the sources of energy wastage, the locations of energy wastage, but not really result in energy savings. So to that extent, as I said, it is a way station, not a destination. The destination is, has the company or has that economic activity saved energy? And the only way to do it is to implement a measurement and verification system. If a company has an MNV system, a before and an after, then clearly they'll know whether they have saved energy, because earlier they were consuming X amount of energy. Today they're consuming Y amount of energy, and X minus Y is what they have saved, and they can track that. So I'm always of the opinion that an energy audit with an MNV system is the way to go. I'm not sure if I answered this question, but making an energy audit mandatory does not necessarily mean that energy will be saved. Rather, we should make MNV mandatory. Measurement and verification protocols mandatory in Indian industry. And once that happens, the rest will follow.
I think that that quite to a large extent answers that question, because M&V is something that we have been lacking on for quite some time now. The next question is from Shweta from CSTEP. Shweta is basically asking the regulatory setup for energy conservation principles is still guided by the Electricity Act. So, do you think any changes are needed in the regulatory space to uh, enforce or to bring about energy productivity?
A lot of work
And
needs to be done on the regulatory angle. One thing which is very clear, I think, from my presentation is that we need to make integrated resource planning mandatory. Once you have an IRP process installed and initiated, then in that case, one can then start going the next step forward in identifying specific projects. So an IRP process has to be made mandatory and that can only be done through regulatory means. The second point, as I mentioned in one of my slides, is that energy productivity is much more broader than just an energy efficiency regulations. You need regulations on energy productivity which enables the organization going in for energy productivity to be able to meet requirements related to MRTP acts, requirements related to the Company Act, requirements related to getting more finances from financial institutions, etc., because it's an order of magnitude difference. It's essentially a structural change, and to accelerate structural change requires regulations way and beyond the orbit of a electricity regulatory commission. So you can't have an energy productivity regulations within the confines of an electricity regulatory mechanism. You have to kind of see it as a much broader mandate because the issues are also much broader. Issues related to environmental impact of an industry which is beginning to modernize. I mean, it may not be under the purview of the regulatory commission. So we need to put our thinking caps on and find out which are the institutional mechanisms in place in the country which can take upon itself the mandate to push Indian industry and Indian economic activities towards a higher productivity plane. And you'll find that energy ministry and the energy departments are only one component. There are others too.
There is one more question from Mr. Sandeep Tandon. Yeah, his question is that you are mentioning the decoupling of economic growth and energy consumption in quite a few OECD countries. His question is basically how much is the contribution to decoupling done by structural changes and how much due to investment in energy efficiency?
Excellent question. I wish I had done that research, Sandeep. I did part of that research for Saudi Arabia when I was in CAPSAC. But let me answer the question generally. See, energy efficiency will enable you to reduce energy intensity. And to that extent, there'll be a certain level of decoupling which will happen on account of it. It will not completely decouple. There'll be some relative decoupling. But if you want to move from relative decoupling, and let me define relative decoupling once again. Relative decoupling is when your GDP increases and your energy consumption also increases, but the rate of growth of energy consumption is lower than what it was previously. So you're decoupling, but relatively. It's not absolute decoupling in a country like India. And energy productivity will give you that decoupling at a relative basis much sooner and much quicker and much faster than just energy efficiency. As I said, energy efficiency would have its limitations. You can only do this much with this technology unless you modernize. And the moment you diversify or modernize, then you're moving into another realm of thinking altogether, which is the productivity improvement area of value addition. So to answer your question, it'll be largely energy productivity which will give you the real decoupling effect, whether it's relative or whether it's absolute. And that's what happened in China, and that's what happened in the other countries too.
So we have another question from Saptak. Saptak has said that he wants to ask it directly. Saptak, you said it's quite difficult to type it out. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Sorry, thank you for the talk so far. So the question that I have is that at the moment, as you said, industry contributes to a huge percent of potential savings in terms of energy efficiency. And a lot of it comes from the MSME sector, which is rarely covered under schemes like PAT. And the problem that we have seen is that most of these MSMEs do not have the investment power to make these capital investments. So while some of them have the 1 megawatt threshold, their options for deep decarbonization is to go for open access, which many times they get from somebody who makes the initial investment and sells them power at a cheaper rate and clean power, or sometimes the utility blocks them, but still open access is working for them. So what is there a possibility of energy service or energy efficiency service companies to make initial investments in smaller MSME clusters like Pina and Bangalore and have some way of monetizing either heat or any of the energy savings? So is that kind of thought process being discussed in any of the circles which make decisions on energy efficiency in the country?
Well, to begin with, I think the MSME sector presents challenges which is not there in the large sectors of industry. And you outlined some of the challenges. One is management challenges, antiquated technologies. Third is the level at which they operate. Many of them operate at subcritical levels in terms of capacities and so on and so forth. So all of this results in high energy intensity of use. And then also there's also this attitudinal issue, because in the MSME sector you don't come and theorize. You see, you have to go in and really actually practically implement. So from that point of view, an MSME sector might be a very interesting target for ESCOs, and ESCO would probably be welcomed into an MSME sector if it can demonstrate very convincingly that this particular widget that it has introduced can save energy. Now, this is a theory. But to get ESCOs interested sufficiently to work in an MSME and to make the kind of capital contribution has always been a problem, because the credit worthiness of the MSME, etc., etc. Now, if there are credit guarantees of the kind that the World Bank has, partial credit guarantees, which can then be extended to a contract between an MSME and a private sector ESCO, I'm sorry, between MSME and a private sector ESCO, then possibly, yeah, one can look at that. One can certainly look at it. To my mind, and I'm not sure that I've answered your question, but to my mind, the next challenge, as far as the first law efficiency is concerned, is which is really energy savings, is concerned in India, is the MSME sector. We just need to kind of pull in the MSME sector, just as we pulled in the 80s and 90s, the large-scale industry, which were able to introduce a lot of efficiency measures. We need to pull the MSME sector into this, and that's not going to be that easy. And now, particularly because of COVID and so on, there are other, issues too on the table. But an economic stimulus by the government for the MSME sector, especially the energy-intensive MSME sector, which consumes where energy costs are more than 50% of the manufacturing costs, one can look at that strategy. There are other strategies too. One can have partnership between large industry and small industry and get them to work together on an efficiency program for mutual advantage. That's also a possibility. But one needs to get our creative minds around this problem of how do we get MSME sectors to incorporate energy efficiency. I don't have a direct answer to what you're saying, but it's work in process. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Padmanabhan, there is a similar question. I think you have partly touched upon it also. This question is coming from Mr. R. Kumar, and he's saying, why is it that without World Bank and institutional funds in energy efficiency, why is that? I'm sorry, I'm unable to sort of read it properly, but I think his question is, why is it that the World Bank funds that you have talked about, like the partial risk guarantee fund and all, why they are not finding a good uptake in the industry as of now?
I'm not close enough to that particular project. I think the right person to answer that question would be somebody from SIDBI or Ashok Sarkar. But let me, I was with the World Bank in much of the 90s, and we had lines of credit on energy efficiency, not just in India, but in some other countries. And these lines of credit were not always utilized to the extent that we would like to see it being utilized. But remember, the financing of energy efficiency largely in this country is not through bank financing. Neither is it through ESCO financing. It is all coming out of the reserve funds of the industry themselves. I'm not talking about MSMEs as such, I'm talking about other sectors of the industry. And that's where a large amount of money is going. No one is tracking it, no one has a sense of how much is being spent. Believe me, industry, it's probably among the costliest in the world, and many of them are doing what it takes, at least to bring about energy efficiency. At least the must-dos, as I said in that particular slide of mine, has been incorporated, and they're not looking for bank financing, etc. Now, where the World Bank came in with SIDBI was to bring about a certain amount of incentivization in the process, especially for industries which are not very creditworthy. Which is one of the ironies. There's an irony which we actually saw way back in the 80s. And the irony is as simple as this. And I'm putting it in very simple terms. As industry, and particularly a small scale industry, which is in the red, is in the red because its cost of manufacture is very high and is not marketable. And the reason why its cost of manufacture is very high is because its energy costs are very high. And because of that, they are in the red. And because they are in the red, they are not able to raise money from banks. So it's a catch-22 situation. And it continues to remain that even to this day. Then how do we support an industry in such a way that they are able to access finance? It's a global issue. It's not only an issue in India, it's a global issue. How do we access the finance required for these industries to make the investments required? And I don't have an answer in this particular talk chat session on that, but it's something that we need to put our minds together on.
You mentioned somebody from World Bank could be able to answer. So right now we have a question from the World Bank. Mr. Ashok Sarkar from the World Bank is asking, there are two questions he has. How do we treat the potential of jobs, which is an important element of development now, more so after COVID, in energy productivity? So that is one question. How do we treat the potential of jobs in energy productivity? And secondly, he is asking, what exactly can be done more to get electric utilities in India into energy efficiency as much as they are integrating rooftop solar PV and electric vehicles? So two questions from Mr. Sarkar are there.
Well, both are very good questions. Let me answer the second question first. How to get Indian utilities to buy into demand side management or demand response has been a challenge. And to some extent, there has been some success with some distribution companies having introduced demand response programs, particularly in lighting and so on, but they've been largely private utilities, private distribution companies. But the larger distribution companies and definitely the state-run companies have not embraced demand side management to the extent that they could. So that has always been something which many of us have tried to put our minds together. And one way would be, obviously, there's been a marked improvement from the past, no doubt about it, but that's something that work needs to be done. How do we get them? And And the numbers are overwhelming. I mean, in terms of the economy to the company, but the ability to reach out to customers and work with customers and so on has always been a challenge. The second question, the second point on jobs. And I'm glad that Ashok asked this question, because that's a question that we in India need to be asking more ourselves. There is enough evidence that an efficiency program creates more jobs than a supply program. I mean, this is in general terms. But how do we ensure that these jobs are created and these jobs are nurtured and these jobs are available? And that's always, again, another challenge. I think we need to come out with more evidence to this effect. See, in many cases, the core benefits of efficiency have not really struck decision makers as important enough, or data and information on the core benefits haven't had a profile of their own. To my mind, saving energy through energy efficiency is passé. It's there. It's accepted. The other core benefits of energy efficiency probably are more important than the energy savings themselves. And job creation is certainly one of them. At this time of our economy, in this country, as well as generally talking about the global situation, job creation is extremely important. And if efficiency can lead to more jobs, then a supply strategy, then clearly the motivation to move towards large-scale efficiency would be there. And I think that's where we need to get more evidence to this level. See, tracking efficiency at the macro level has always been a difficult job. You can track a generating plant and its performance on a day-to-day basis, on a minute-to-minute basis. But how much of efficiency is happening at this particular point in time in a particular grid. I mean, it's the data requirement and the analysis is of a different order altogether. Similarly, you are not able to track the benefits that come out of efficiency, the environmental benefits and the social benefits, such as job creation. And that's where we need to create that for evidence and need evidence. Bank, probably the right organization to do the kind of research required to generate the evidence that an efficiency strategy creates far more jobs in an environmentally sound way than an energy supply strategy. And if they can do that convincingly, then I think that's a step in the right direction. So I put the ball back again and say that, hey, you guys need to do this.
I think you have pointed out a very important message there, that efficiency creates far more co-benefits than direct investments in on the generation side. So I think it is around 5:45, and we have overshot our budgeted time by 15 minutes. So I think we will not take any further questions now. So, Mr. Padmanabhan, it has been great talking to you. The first thing when we first spoke for this, in order to have this webinar, the first thing that I really enjoyed was that somehow you were able to recollect that we have met long back, and that was really good. And today, having spoken at length about energy productivity, I think we have uh, we have gained from not only your experience and so much of experience, but also your vision of the future. And I think it has been, although there were some brief hiccups because of the connectivity issue, I think overall it was a good session that we had. And I'm glad so many people participated. I guess we had more than 45-50 people around there. So over to you, Neha, if you want to conclude or say something.
Yeah, I would like to thank both Mr. Padu and Mr. Abhishek for being here. And I would just like to tell you that we had about 65 attendees in the session. I think we saw 100% attendance. Mostly everybody we invited was able to make it. So it was a great session. And as you said, that despite of the technical glitches that we had a few times, it was overall a great session, and we look forward to more such informative and productive sessions going forward. Thank you to both of you, and thank you to all our attendees for making it.
Thank you,
Thank you
Neha.
very much.
Thank you, Abhishek.